In this section, we begin to study Chapter 5, Strategies for the Protection and Reuse of Historical Buildings. In the previous chapters, we have mentioned the protection of historical buildings at this stage in the development process of historical building protection. It has evolved from the preservation and maintenance of cultural relics to the stage of focusing on the adaptive reuse of a large number of existing historical buildings in the city. Here, let's go a little further on the concept of reuse. It is to carry on new functions of a historic building or reconstruction so that the historical building can extend its mission as use space, thereby extending its life and meaning. So the strategies for preservation and reuse of historical buildings are based on the concept of historical buildings in cities, to find out various values of historical buildings and put forward the design strategies and methods to transform the value potential of these historical buildings into new urban vitality. In this chapter, we will explain in detail the strategies for the protection and reuse of historic buildings from three aspects: the texture of city architecture symbiosis, the space-time correlation of new-old space symbiosis, and the form compatibility of context architecture symbiosis. Here we learn the first section of this chapter, the mechanism weaving strategy of urban building symbiosis. You must understand that a historic building itself and its external environment together constitute the historical environment. So, in the design of historic building conservation and reuse, you should make an overall plan based on the principle of integrity. How to achieve the symbiosis between historical building and urban environment? First of all, we should focus on the following three aspects. First, we should pay attention to the historical hierarchy of architectural ontology, understanding the levels of the historical building formed by historical changes and the importance of each level. This is a very important foundation for our intervention design. Second, pay attention to the relationship between architecture and urban texture, which is embodied in the architectural space form and adaptation on the urban level and the continuation of spatial activities. Third, we should pay attention to the relationship between historic building and the regional landscape. The historical building is treated as part of the whole city landscape, thus realizing the integration and the historical building with its surroundings and the whole city landscape. So we've adopted three main strategies for these three relationships. The first is to continue the texture of the city. The second is to control the urban space interface. The third is to adopt a common space penetration strategy. What is city texture? City texture is the exterior expression of the city, including the form of the city, the form of road networks, the scale of blocks, the scale of buildings, the mode of combination, etc. It is a collection of architectural volume and public open spaces in a district, which embodies a series of geometric features. The figure-ground relationship can reflect the texture of the city. We take the figure-ground relationship of Yongqingfang block of Enning Road in Guangzhou as an example. Black is building, white is the scale and the geometric form of the building and open space formed by the street. We can analyze from this graph the density of buildings, the width and the density of streets and the lanes, and the distribution characteristics of open space nodes, etc. The city texture can reflect the collective consensus of space shaping formed in a certain evolutionary time. That is, people's habit of a space feeling formed in a region for a long time. So when we want to carry out the historic building protection design in the city level, it should start from the city texture. The design of preservation and reuse of historic buildings should play a role in viewing the texture of a city. Let's take a common example of life. This picture is a denim with a pattern texture. If there is a hole in it, how can I mend it? That hole to this denim is like our transformation projects to the city. In view of the city's preservation design of historic buildings, we should learn to patch. The historic building is used as a city patch, sieving and weaving the damaged texture of the city. Next, we will explain two kinds of stitching strategies with two cases. The first is to control the spatial scale of historical environment. We take Yongqingfang Street reconstruction of Enning Road in Xiguan Old Town, Guangzhou as an example. It is a historic district renewal project in 2016. Let's look at this picture. It is an overlook of the block before the reconstruction. In this picture, we can see that the texture of this block is in a state of destruction. Its old buildings are badly damaged. Some have been demolished. The texture is not very clear. How can we get its block texture? It is necessary to search through a series of documents such as old drawings and era photographs of different ages. Based on this analysis, we have sorted out its original urban texture, as is shown in the drawing. The block buildings are in a long and deep direction from north to south, and its north-south block depth is proportional to the street depth. At the same time, its east-west opening is very narrow, and the texture is door-to-door. We sorted out this original texture of the city block. When we reconstruct this block, we put forward different reuse strategies for different buildings. But no matter which kind of strategy is used, each building must be able to continue the city texture. Using the strategy of controlling the scale of historical space environment to carry on the block reconstruction, finally forming such an overall look after reconstruction. Let's look at this aerial photograph. A contrast with the city texture before reconstruction. The city texture is very clear after reconstruction, which can awaken people's memory of this area. In 2018, when General Secretary Xi went to Guangzhou for an inspection, he gave it a high elevation after visiting Yongqingfang, saying that Yongqingfang is a place where the city can return memories and people can remember nostalgia. This is a strategy of stitching texture in accordance with the city texture. Let's take a closer look at the denim. It is a very functional denim. I can see that its patches are not only compliant with the texture, but at the same time there is a breakthrough. That is, we can adopt the adaptation strategy of Guangzhou Yongqingfang, and at the same time we can adopt a breakthrough strategies of heterogeneous intervention in the urban texture, and we can also adopt the strategy of blocking weaving. But no matter which strategies you use, you must be based on the study of texture. Let's go into detail about the second urban texture weaving strategy, optimizing the spatial layout of historical environments. We take the Tangshan Museum renovation and expansion project designed by the Urban Practice Institute in 2011 as an example. The predecessor of Tangshan Museum was built in 1968 and was the exhibition hall of Mao Zedong Thought Victory. Let's look at this overall plan texture map. The project is located in Tangshan Phoenix Mountain Park, which is the area of the circular contour in the picture. The base is in the red area of the east side of the park. The group painted by the teacher in the picture is the spatial layout of the original building. The original historical building is very important because it is one of the few large buildings that survived the Tangshan earthquake in 1976. Therefore, the original historical building itself is the largest exhibit in the newly built museum. When the architect reconstructs and expands the building, he mainly considers the relationship between the building and the surrounding environment from the outside. The focus of building reconstruction and expansion is not on the building itself, but on its relationship with the surrounding environment. The designer emphasized that every intervention strategy should become a kind of hiding behavior to optimize the status quo. The architect retains the original plan layout of the figure-shaped pattern formed by the three sides of the south, the west, and the north. Since each of the three directions is independent, each needs to be entered separately. So on this basis, two new pavilions are added to the vacancies in the northwest and the southwest, which are the red blocks in the general map. The newly added part makes up for the missing of the old building proportion in the overall plan layout and optimized the spatial layout of historical environment. When we stand in Phoenix Mountain looking towards the museum, the old building is still kept as the main landscape of the whole complex, but the whole space looks full and complete. The architect adopted a more subtle texture stitching strategy in the corner, which we can call a kind of blanking weaving. We are back on the square, standing on the square and looking at this perspective view of the top of the building in the distance. The newly built part is placed inside the corner. It did not destroy the existing visual relationship between the old building and the background mountain, thus preserving the citizens' memory of the city. Tangshan Museum is a project interpreting the spatial order and historic texture in the historic environment. The patching strategy of optimizing the spatial layout of the historical environment is adopted to allow mutual penetration and harmonious coexistence between the building and the environment, which not only satisfies the functional requirements of the new area, but also achieves a good continuity of urban texture. Now let me summarize what we have learned. In this lesson, with the concept of urban texture, we learned how to stitch urban texture with the reused design of historic buildings, so as to achieve the function of continuing the urban context.